went from modeling plants working as a PhD student in my lab to modeling society at the University of New Hampshire and thinking about how you try to find solutions in the different scenarios by which people come to decisions to try to find solutions. And so it's been real fun for me to watch Alexandra's career blossom since she got out of the world of Basel and into the world of sort of the New Hampshire landscape. And she's actually even more recently done some really cool work on thinking about how much land, what is the sustainability of sort of meat production in the Northeast, working down at the Friedman School. So she brings together an incredible ability to sort of think about where are the data sets. There are lots of data sets out there. There are land cover data sets. They're not always in one place. It's not one-stop shopping. You've got to find those data sets. And then you've got to figure out, so who cares about the kinds of questions? And so how do you network with different kinds of stakeholders? She likes to call them colleagues, and she'll tell us a little bit about that in a minute. And then instead of trying to say, well, here's one solution, what are the different kinds of options? And this brings us into this idea of scenario analysis. And so I'm really excited to have Alexandra come and present some of the work that she's been doing since she left Tufts University. So welcome her back, and thank you for coming.
Thank you for inviting me, and thanks for that great introduction. I'm really excited to be here. I haven't gotten to talk about this research in a while, and it was really a fun and complicated project. It's also great to be back on the Medford campus. You know, I've had the Tufts email address for a bit, but you know, I feel like I'm kind of coming home. So thank you for having me. I want to start by telling you a little story. This is a story about ancient Egypt. And the story goes that on the Nile River, in the time of the pharaohs had priests who lived on the river in what is now northern Sudan. And the priest each year would look at the color of the water. And if the watercolor was very light in color, that was indicative that the water was predominantly coming from the White Nile, and that there would be minimal flooding. There would still be the ability to do the agriculture on the Nile Delta, but the productivity would not be that high, and so it would be a time to be careful. If the water was a little bit darker, that's indicative that the water is predominantly coming from the Blue Nile, which tended to indicate that there would be lots of flooding, and there would be a good yield of crops that year. And then finally, if the water was kind of murky green-brown color, that indicated that you're going to have too much flooding, and that you might even want to open up your grain reserves. And so this allowed the pharaohs to plan what they were going to do in the year ahead, you know, who they're going to try to conquer, whether they wanted to be careful or more expansive. This story is illustrative of the idea of different futures that might happen. The priests were aware that there were different scenario outcomes for crop productivity in the year ahead, and were using the information they had in order to develop informed choices. So that's kind of, you know, very big picture background on scenarios. What I want to talk about today is kind of, it's about New Hampshire scenarios, but it's also just kind of about scenarios in general and how tangled up this process gets. So what I hope you get out of this talk is scenarios can be useful, but the development process can be really messy. I also hope that you'll see that there's not a single way to do scenarios, and I hope you'll come away with just kind of questions about what is the relationship between scientists and society? How do we as researchers, potentially as scientists, potentially as social scientists, engage with people out in communities? Are we interested in having living a relationship with them, or trying to set some sort of boundary and say that we are trying to be impartial? So the roadmap for the talk, background on scenarios, and then I want to talk to you about the New Hampshire scenarios themselves. I'll talk about the kind of the process of how we developed our scenarios. I'll talk about a couple of ways that those scenarios have been applied, and then I'm going to talk very, very briefly about a little bit of broader context for scenarios in the region. Okay. So historical background on scenarios. Scenarios originally came out of military background. This was mostly kind of a tactical use. So thinking about a specific engagement. But this guy, Herman Kahn, whoops, oh geez, really started to think about scenarios as like really big picture societal stuff. He was doing scenarios for nuclear war. And if you've seen the movie Dr. Strangelove, he was actually an inspiration for some of the characters in that movie. He was very much in the idea of nuclear deterrence and the idea that by having machines that could destroy the world, you could prevent war. And he was able to sell these stories using scenarios for possible outcomes of a nuclear conflict. His sort of intellectual descendant is Pierre Wack, who in the 1970s worked for the Royal Dutch Shell Company, and kind of his kind of big moment in selling scenarios to really the business community was that he had this insight that despite the conventional wisdom that oil prices were going to just continue to be low forever, and that the oil companies should plan based on that, that the oil-producing countries, OPEC, could, and it was looking like they likely would, change their approach and start sequestering the oil and cause prices to go up. And he used two scenarios, the conventional narrative and the OPEC protectionist narrative, to convince Shell that they needed to prepare for both outcomes. And the result for Shell was that they went from being a relatively minor player in the petroleum industry to being really one of the big ones. And he went on to influence scenarios as they're done in business. And then from there, scenarios are kind of all over the place now, and they've become huge in the realm of environmental planning. I want to talk very briefly about two very well-known global scenario sets that you may have encountered. One thing I did want to say about Pierre Wack is that, that he had initially tried to sell scenarios, this kind of very dry presentation of quantitative predictions of what's going to happen if X, Y, Z, and it didn't work. What he needed to do was to really tell a story similar to what the Ghost of Christmas Future tells Ebenezer Scrooge in the Christmas Carol, kind of a very vivid description of what the future could look like. And that's kind of a piece of the scenarios literature that you see time and again, and I think that different scenarios have different levels of success in doing this. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Scenarios, wow, I did some last minute edge to the presentation. I'm sorry for the disjointedness. Right. So an ideal scenario will be relevant, it will be believable, it will be perceived to be legitimate. This is about perception. And ideally, it will also kind of cause people to think outside of the box. To really, for example, convince the Shell Corporation that they need to think about outcomes they hadn't anticipated. a big part of achieving all of these is who is it that you're trying to be relevant to? Who are you trying to convince? Who are you trying to have view you as legitimate? And how much creativity can you actually get away with given your chosen audience? And so a way that this is addressed is by engaging stakeholders. So you have conversations with your identified stakeholders, and there's this open question of who is that supposed to be? Is it supposed to be a man on the street? Is it supposed to be powerful people who can make decisions? Is it supposed to be people who maybe have an important story to say but don't have as much power? But you engage with stakeholders in order to try to find out what they need, make it relevant for them, make sure that the story you're going to tell is consistent with their understanding of the way the world works, make it believable, and to otherwise suit it to kind of their understandings of, you know, how information is flowing. This is an illustration of the scenarios for the Millennium ecosystem assessment. A couple things I wanted to highlight here. One is that they've really made a nice use of visuals. So they have these different axes of, you know, how much emphasis on globalization, regionalization, or we're talking about something that's reactive or proactive. And they've got these cute names like Technogarden. But then for the Technogarden, you've got all kinds of visual cues of the type of technological engagement you're going to have between society and the natural world. You've got the wind turbines, you've got the person at the computers, you've got the greenhouses. Whereas, for example, for adapting Mosaic, you've got some of the same things, but you've also got some other elements. So it's a mixed picture. That's the more regional variant. The other thing is what I was talking about how they've got these two axes of variation. And this comes up a lot in scenarios where you kind of you try to find two ways in which the world could contrast and fit your scenarios into that. Another set of scenarios that is probably quite familiar if you've done anything in any way related to climate science is the climate scenarios. So this is the special report on emission scenarios version, where again we have the two axes, and they're very similar. There's the more global axis and the economic versus environmental, global versus regional, economic versus environmental, and then you have these scenarios that fall within it. Within A1, which is a scenario where you have good solid economic growth, kind of moderate population growth, there's some different energy futures that they also consider. So there's different variants within that. So if you see one of these graphs with A1 FI versus B2, you know, plotted on the line graph, that's what these are. And each of these quadrants here has a story that goes with it. More recently, this group that calls themselves the Global Scenarios Group did a really interesting kind of review and synthesis of all the big scenarios out there. And the conclusion they came to was that there actually aren't that many different scenario sets. That if you look at the archetypes that they've identified, and you look at any given scenario set, you can probably fit it into these archetypes in some way. So there's the conventional scenarios where you have, you know, either kind of like a free market situation or maybe more of a New Deal policy management approach. There's barbarization, which kind of has two branches to it. One is this like total collapse Mad Max society, and then there's the fortress world scenario, which is more kind of fascistic, the highly militarized nationalistic stories. And then there's the kind of thing that we all kind of hope for, the great transitions, where we fundamentally change the way society is structured in order to either use technology or human relationships to just build a better future. And then there's one other kind of facet to this that I want to talk about briefly, which is the newer climate scenarios. How many people are familiar with the RCPs? Okay, so this is new to you guys. So this is a graph you might have seen of climate projections. This is one particular model that's using these different SRES scenarios, the scenarios I was talking about earlier. The IPCC discovered they were running into a problem where they would have the new climate trajectory, and all the physical scientists run out and run their new relation-based models based on that. And meanwhile, the social scientists would be like, oh, we messed up that one thing in the economic model. And so the economists and the sociologists would redo their model and say, okay, no, you guys need to update your research to fix it to match our new understanding of the way society works. And so they said, you know what? We know that you can have a low emissions future, a high emissions future, and a couple of intermediate emissions futures. Let's just create some different trajectories and use social scientists to try to figure out what would create each of these trajectories while we go ahead and do all of the physical modeling based on these different trajectories. So in this case, the numbers that are associated with the different RCPs are actually quantifying what would be the energy forcing, what would be the energy balance in the year 2100 for each of these trajectories. And that's kind of all there is to it. There's that number and there's the line that it takes to get there. And then, then there's lots of freedom to play at both ends. And so this is kind of a very different approach from the very illustrative Millennium Ecosystem Services example that I gave with the vivid pictures. A little bit closer to home. This is scenarios that came out of Harvard Forest. So this is my colleague Jonathan Thompson and a bunch of people he's working with came up with a set of scenarios for Massachusetts, and they had a big kind of press release. I think it was 2015, and then they finally got it out as a scientific publication in 2016. And their scenarios don't fit into that nice little 2x2 matrix. They have a recent trend scenario, an opportunistic growth scenario, which is kind of the free market with a healthy economy scenario where you've got lots of sprawl. Forest is infrastructure, where the state of Massachusetts strategically thinks about using its forests to produce timber and also to regulate the flow of water in the river systems. And the regional reliance scenario, which is more of an agricultural scenario. That's a scenario in which there's an expansion of farmland. I'm going to revisit that a little bit later because there's other scenarios that informed that and that also informed our work. And we made different choices. So this then segues into the project that I became part of. And I guess there's a slide missing. Oh well. Which is funded by the EPSCoR program, which is an NSF program that is dedicated to funding interdisciplinary, interinstitutional grants in states that don't normally get a lot of research money. And so even though I live in Massachusetts, where we get lots and lots of research money, I can cross the border into New Hampshire and get funded by an EPSCoR program. And the program was a project on ecosystems of society, and there were kind of several different parts to it. There was a sensor network that was using remote sensing and also sensors placed in soils and streams to monitor at high temporal resolution what was going on with a bunch of processes. there was a modeling group that was trying to develop models for a variety of processes, photosynthesis, river flows, et cetera. And then there was the scenarios group, which was these kind of scenarios and evaluation. So that was to come up with the inputs for the models, and then also evaluate the outcomes. And the evaluation piece was something I was less involved with, but is a step of the project that I was definitely kind of like on the sidelines and participate in some of the workshops. So land cover scenarios combined with existing climate scenarios to give input to these ecosystem process models, and then ultimately there's some sort of ecosystem services that come out of that. Carbon sequestration, water quality regulation, food production, and figuring out how we as a society value those things. A little bit of background on New Hampshire. So New Hampshire is predominantly forest. That's not uncommon for New England. Less developed than Massachusetts, although the southeastern corner of the state has seen a whole lot of development in recent years. It's kind of a little bit on the periphery of the Boston metro area, and otherwise has seen an influx of a lot of kind of young, wealthy families. So there's been lots of development there. There's also this corridor along I-93 that kind of funnels that up into the rest of the state. And the capital is Concord, which I guess is here, another kind of major center. But largely it's a rural state. It's also a state with kind of the idiosyncrasies of politics, where generally libertarian, live free or die license plates, but also Republicans in New Hampshire are not like Republicans in other places. They tend to actually really think about landscapes and want to protect nature, although they might think about doing it in a different way than a Democrat might. So it's an interesting place to be working. So our approach was not, I guess, kind of the recommended type of approach for a participatory scenario development process. There's kind of these various formulations and even mathematical tools out there for how to produce scenarios based on stakeholder engagement, and how to do that in a way that's not going to bias the stakeholders and is going to be as representative as possible of diverse voices. We drew on a whole bunch of different types of information. So we looked at recent trends in land cover change, recent trends in population, a little bit of demographics. We looked at surveys of kind of get the man on the street perspective that way. We had a bunch of different kind of, stakeholders are already out there and speaking with plans and visions for how the state should develop. And then there were population projections. We also had a kind of social sciencey part where we went and we interviewed stakeholders. These were kind of our key informants, the people with some sort of special perspective or knowledge on the state, and we tried to represent a diversity of interests there. And then these key informants, some of them kind of blended into these subject matter experts, so people that we engaged in order to get very specific information. So, talk about this in a little bit more detail. Recent trends in the state, there's been a lot of growth in the southern part of the state, especially in the more urban areas, and there's actually been a decline in population in the northern part, which is this very highly rural. It used to be a timber, paper mill area. That's now kind of giving way to biofuels. The New England paper industry, much to the shock of a lot of the kind of people who've been working in the region for a while, has basically collapsed. But you can still grind up the trees and use them as fuel for power plants. There's a prison up there. There's a very, very kind of rural, poor, depressed economy, and it's been shrinking, and it's been shifting toward an older population too. So something that a lot of our stakeholders were concerned about was not that there was going to be rampant growth that was going to pave the entire state, but that you're going to have a shrinking population and an aging population need to deal with that. The surveys gave us kind of a perspective on how stakeholders think about ecosystem services. So 70% of respondents were in favor of minimizing development. This is part of that kind of environmental conservationist ethic in New Hampshire. People want New Hampshire to continue to be a forested state. They don't like the idea of it turning into wall-to-wall subdivisions. Very high support for protecting water quality. My mentor, Cameron Wake, does lots of climate research, but was also my mentor on the Scenarios project, thinks that it's kind of that people love what they have, that New Hampshire has great water, and so they want to protect the water that they have, whereas if you talk to somebody in California, they'd say, I love how sunny it is. But that's kind of a window for somebody who might be more of an environmental stakeholder into how to sell the New Hampshire residents on the importance of protecting a piece of land. Generally, high interest in protecting aquatic habitats. Also interest in investment in infrastructure, although interestingly not much interest in kind of the more urban infrastructure, the mass transit types of infrastructure. Okay. I want to see what's going on with these slides. Because yeah, I don't know. Okay. I could just resume from current slide.
Yeah.
Okay. So we kind of knew almost from the beginning. I had an idea of what our scenarios would be, which a lot of social science kind of what are you doing? You need to be unbiased. You need to not anticipate where it's going. But the people that I was working with had been working in New Hampshire for a long time and had a bunch of relationships with people working in the state, with people at Nature Conservancy, people at the Society for Protection of Natural New Hampshire Forest, which I will later pronounce as SPINIF. Cameron Wake had previously served on the group that put together the climate action plan for the state. So he had already been on an interdisciplinary, field panel of people working on this. And so we're very much working from those relationships. We knew that there was going to be a lots of sprawl scenario, and we knew that there was going to be some sort of a scenario that involved compact development or less development. And we'll talk a little bit more about the distinction between those, because it's not quite the same. We also were, had lots of colleagues who were in some way affiliated with the New England Food Vision, which is out of Harvard Forest, but then also out of Brandeis, because Brian Donahue, who's kind of the father of all of this, is a faculty at Brandeis. This is a vision for how New England could feed itself better. And they came up with two different scenarios that they described. One of them is called Omnivore's Delight. There's called Regional Reliance. And the Omnivore's Delight scenario is not that we're going to take care of all our food needs, but that 50% of the calories consumed in New England would be produced in New England. And they're able to point to the strength of the New England dairy industry, that we're well on our way to being self-sufficient with regard to dairy, and other types of foods might not need that much land, to say this is entirely compatible with conservation of natural resources. The regional reliance scenario was more of our hand is forced. What are we going to do if there's an infrastructural breakdown, an economic collapse, that means that we actually have to produce our own food? What are we capable of doing for ourselves? And so that ends up being much more calories produced locally, and also maybe less calories overall, less of an enjoyable plate. If you think back to the scenario archetypes, I would say that Omnivore's Delight is more of a great transition, like reimagine what New England could be, and that regional reliance is almost more of a barbarization scenario. The Massachusetts scenarios used regional reliance. So their regional reliance scenario was the scenario that food solutions New England doesn't want. It was kind of an unhappy scenario. We decided to go with the one that they do like, the Omnivore's Delight scenario. But also, if you get a bunch of scenarios, conservation people in a room, they're really going to disagree about this. So we went back and forth about what are our scenarios going to be. We've got lots of sprawl. We've got linear trends. We've got this kind of protect our resources scenarios, but what is that going to look like? Is it going to have more local food, more agriculture? We're going to clear some forests for that, or is it going to really prioritize the forests? And this was reflected in our conversations with stakeholders later on. We also used population projections. We did not have a demographer on our team. So rather than trying to produce a population projection, not knowing what we're doing, we decided to just use existing predictions. So our high population scenario is directly from EPA ICLUS, which is in turn from the IPCC scenarios, the old ones. That the A2 scenario is a high growth, high emissions scenario. But we use that for a couple different of our scenarios. We also looked at kind of the best estimate of what New Hampshire's future would be, which really the demographers don't even like going out to 2040. So this is kind of like 2040 is as far as they go. But I had the privilege of being able to correspond with the guy who'd written this projection, and he actually, put in a night and figured out what the extrapolation of that projection would be. He said, this isn't what's going to happen. He was very clear about that. But this is at least a low population scenario that gets us out to 2100, and that is aligned with what a lot of our state representative type stakeholders thought was the most likely thing to happen. And then there was the key informant interviews. So there was these 5 different sectors that we tried to represent. And this is not in any way quantitative. And if you're a social scientist, the approach we used was very much a snowball approach, where it was, we talked first to our own network, and then talked to who do you know that we should be talking to. So we tried to cover all those major interests, but we weren't trying to do it in any sort of quantitative way. The key themes that emerged from these interviews were that what the population is going to do is important, and that there was everything from the very conventional, current trends continue, aging New Hampshire, we're going to have problems trying to take care of the older population because there won't be enough young people paying taxes, up to the entire state is going to be subdivisions all the way up into the North Country. Patterns of development was also highlighted. So are we talking about compact development? Are we talking about traditional subdivisions? Which, by the way, in New Hampshire, that means 2-acre lots You know, some municipalities it's 1 acre lots, some it's 4, but by and large it's 2 acre lots everywhere. What's the conservation future? And then this piece of what's the role of agriculture and forestry. I'm not going to go too much into the imagined futures. To kind of just like put this slide up. But we asked the 2 questions of what do people want and what do they expect? And whether this is because of our own network or because of just kind of the reality of the situation, that sprawl scenario that I talked about is not what anybody wanted. Even the developers that we talked to said, it's expensive, you've got to put down new infrastructure, I'd much rather build closer to the city. And the market was going to correct this. So this is kind of the like free market New Hampshire Republican perspective, that people already want smaller houses. That sprawl scenario isn't what's going to happen. It was the environmental groups who said the sprawl scenario is going to happen. So this is what people wanted. This is what people expected. There's that difference in the population futures between the shrinking population and the growing population. And this is our scenarios framework, which you know has the 2 axes, but it's actually kind of only 1 axis. Everything is along this continuum from low value place on ecosystem services and dispersed development. We rebranded the sprawl scenario as something that sounds nicer. Backyard amenities. You enjoy that 2 acre lot you've got. To concentrated development and a high value place on ecosystem services. So, you know, my like desire to dissect things and be reductionist, like I really want to fill in these other 2 quadrants. And in fact, we talked about this one other scenario, the amenity scenario, where there's a few people in, I think this was something that met at Spinif, although I'm not sure, who really wanted to have kind of a high-tech economy where people had lots of green infrastructure, they had solar panels on their houses, they had their gardens, but that it was still very much an ecologically focused society. But in the interest of minimizing the number of scenarios, we decided not to pursue that. And also because our scenarios weren't really geared toward building those narratives. Our scenarios ultimately were to be input for models of changes in the state. So we wanted to see big differences. And then within the community amenity scenarios, there were 4 variants. Wildlands and food, I've already highlighted, and then also the 2 population scenarios. So the large community scenario has exactly the same population projection as the backyard amenity scenario, whereas the small community scenario is the kind of the expected future. And this has different implications for what New Hampshire would look like. Are we talking about a vibrant urban centers that produce a market for the rural goods, or are we talking about this kind of a much slower economy? There was also statistical models that went into this. I'm not going to get into this too much, but I pulled together a bunch of data sets, published data sets out there for a type of model called a regression tree, which instead of fitting a curve to the data, it identifies a natural split in the data. And so you can identify predictors that produce discrete categorical information, and it also is a good way of capturing nonlinear relationships. So this is kind of walking through the example of the farmland scenario, or the modeling of where farmland would actually be located. And then through this method, I was able to identify kind of what the big predictors are for the types of land cover change we could have. So if we have, where is the developed land happening? It has to do with remoteness, like how close is it to other development. conservation, also related to remoteness in the other direction. And then farmland has to do with both remoteness and also suitability of the land. The backyard amenity scenario in particular, we had a real privilege because Clay Mitchell, who was originally one of our stakeholders, took a lecturer position at UNH, and Cameron said, hey, Clay, you want to join the group? And Clay's like, yes, I do. I've been really interested in this idea of how communities respond to development within the community. He had this observation, which was kind of something he'd intuited, that he then, as part of the project, was able to basically confirm by looking at the zoning for every single municipality in the state that the states that have adopted cluster zoning are, so the towns that have adopted cluster zoning are the towns that have already seen a lot of development. And there's almost this kind of magical threshold when you surpass 50% development, people start to get uneasy. They're like, it doesn't look like New Hampshire anymore. And like, let's actually be proactive at this point. And so, even for the backyard scenarios, the backyard amenity scenario, there was this conservation element, but it was a very reactive element, and it was quantitative based on his insight and then analysis. So this is the scenarios. You can't really see them. Basically, you end up with, in the food scenario, more like expansion of agriculture in the southeast. And in the backyard amenities scenario, this flare-up of red that expands northward, kind of along the 93 corridor. And there was another kind of moment of, wow, maybe we should have thought about that better earlier on. Like, okay, so we have these development scenarios, and the backyard amenity scenario is already based on population, but the other ones aren't. Where I had to take the land cover change and our population projections we're using and kind of try to like back estimate what the population density would be for different parts of the state. And what I just wanted to highlight here is that for the large communities scenario, what you see is a collapsing down of the number of people living at densities that we think of as exurban or rural. That there's still a lot of people living at what are considered suburban densities. Whereas with the backyard amenity scenario, those categories continue to expand. The other thing that's interesting here is that when you really insist you can't have any undeveloped land be developed, you have to do everything as infill, you start to see high density urban centers, which is what's compatible with transit economically. Okay. I'm going to kind of skip ahead and briefly, these are the conservation scenarios. Light green is where there's already conservation. This map is basically taken directly from the Wildlife Action Plan for the state, the conservation plans by the Nature Conservancy, and the conservation plans by SPINF. So again, we're able to use relationships with stakeholders to get very specific information as input for this. A linear scenario has the same amount of development, the same amount of conservation, because there has been a lot of conservation, but it's not strategic. And then backyard, it's that reactive conservation. This was then used as input for models of ecosystem services in the upper Merrimack watershed. And from there was used to look at various metrics of ecosystem services. The choices they made, they decided to pair the land cover scenarios with specific climate scenarios. So you end up seeing that it looks like that the combination of land cover and climate results in more people affected by flooding. Oh, right, and they also use the small community scenario. So So this difference in flood risk between backyard and small community food doesn't have anything to do with flooding. It has to do with the fact there's more people who can get flooded. That is metric of how many people are being affected. So you expect there to be these really strong effects, and it turns out that in terms of the models that we have, it actually wasn't all that strong. And then there was this interesting social science project, which I can get into a Q&A if you want to. So just to wrap up, we used a bunch of different information sources. This process was strongly dependent on our relationship with stakeholders. And also there's some counterintuitive results. Meanwhile, there's been this parallel scenario effort for all of New England, also coming out of Harvard Forest, where they actually did use the 2x2 matrix. And they were very systematic in their approach. They had these very standardized workshops they held in each, I'm not sure if it's every single state, but in some very key locations, and had these two axes identified by stakeholders in each location, and then kind of synthesized the individual states into a single set of New England scenarios. So a different picture. So there's multiple approaches to scenario development. And then the thing that I come away from is like, I am still not sure whether what we did was the right thing. We used our existing relationships, and we got a lot of information that way. Maybe it's important enough to be impartial, and I don't know the answer to that. So this is kind of the question that I hope you kind of come away with, in addition to just kind of like all of the ins and outs of how messy this process can be. With that, thank you.
Question?
Yeah.
Way back in the beginning, you compared the guy who influenced Dr. Strangelove to the guy from Shell Oil.
Uh-huh.
And you said he kind of morphed into him. Mm-hmm. I didn't understand how they were related.
Okay, so so they were kind of part of the same social circles. So they basically, Pierre Wack was the later figure. And Pierre Wack was the one who turned scenarios from something that's used by the military into something that's used by businesses and then out into a bunch of other uses. He also did a lot in terms of really emphasizing the narrative aspect. That story I told at the beginning about the Nile is actually a story that he liked to tell, because he was finding that the charts and figures didn't do it in terms of persuading people. That you needed to take people a picture.
If I might ask two questions. One is that the maps showed the coastline, being where it is now. Uh-huh. And so I was just wondering how sea level rise might have figured into all of these calculations. And the second is more about you, since you're a Tufts graduate and all that. How did you get from Basel to this?
Okay, very different questions. So Cameron, who's a climate guy, has done a lot of stuff in Great Bay watershed. And he had actually developed some scenarios that were, I think, less well-informed than the ones we ended up with for this cycle around. I don't know a whole lot about the coastline, and part of that's just, there's so much in New Hampshire that has nothing to do with the coast. Cameron likes to talk about how the state has this tiny little coastline, and this is an opportunity to funnel funds disproportionately into seeing what will work. But that wasn't like, this wasn't something that we focused on for this scenario effort. And then in terms of my own narrative, I've been kind of wanting to do sustainable agriculture for a long time. I got a degree in agronomy at UC Davis because I didn't know that's not where you go if you want to do sustainable agriculture. And then I, was burnt out for a couple of years, and then I did a little bit of teaching. I started like to teach. I met Colin. Colin was, good enough to take me into his lab, and I was interested in how plants respond to heterogeneity, and I kind of had this idea from somewhere that you might be able to build more sustainable crop systems if you could exploit that. I love that Colin thinks about how the plants are plumbed, not about the decision making by the plants. But I put together a decision that actually I really feel good about my dissertation. It's like looking at the idea of plant sectoriality from a bunch of different angles. But I had this societal and agricultural focus or interest kind of in the background for a long time. When I was initially hired at UNH, they needed a modeler. And so I ended up working with PNET, which is the ecosystem model. But I mentioned that I was interested in societal stuff. And they had 3 years of postdoctoral funding, and they decided to, instead of hiring one postdoc for 3 years, they'd hire 2 postdocs, one for 2 years and one for 1 year. And so I got hired for 1 year on that grant, and then Scott Ollinger, who was one of the people who hired me, found the EPSCoR money to connect me with this more social sciencey thing. And I wish I knew more about sociology. I feel like it's really important and interesting, and I like thinking about how to understand why people do the weird things we do and how that type of information might help us to make better decisions. So I'm not sure where I'm going, but I really, the move to the Scenarios Project was a lot of fun. And then I've also been really excited to work at Friedman because they're actually doing the kind of sustainable systems type research that I'm interested in. And right now I don't know what's next, so we'll see.
I wanted to follow up a little bit on, I'm not sure if the way we did it was right. So then I want to come back to something you said at the very beginning, the importance of narrative.
Yeah.
It seems to me that your approach is likely to contact the people who are their narrative power brokers in the state of New Hampshire.
Yep.
And so if that is true, wouldn't you therefore contend that your approach is better than a completely randomized Harvard Forest approach, because you are doing your stakeholder engagement with the storytellers of New Hampshire?
Yeah, that's the one side of the argument.
Yeah.
The other side that matters to me, and this is partly because I spent a year kind of hanging on the periphery of the Harvard STS group, the Science and Technology and Society people. I have this kind of lurking concern about scientists as people who wield a lot of power and maybe don't notice how much power we wield. And so I like the idea of using our role as researchers to give a microphone to people who don't normally have a voice. On the other hand, those people might not want to talk to you, and these narrative brokers do, and some of the narrative brokers don't have as much of a voice as other ones. So it's messy. And it's messy in ways, it's like, I find it really compelling and frustrating and all of those things.
One last question.
Advice for students. If students are intrigued by the things you talked about today, where would you recommend they consider courses, interests, career path stuff?
Yeah, so I might be the wrong person to be asking this question of, because I haven't actually taken a lot of those courses. I guess maybe a little bit of lesson is, keep an open mind and you can do different things. Pay attention to stuff outside your discipline. I wish that I'd gotten a degree in political ecology, which is very much about that, that where who gave you microphone to question. But that's not necessarily going to get you into the scenario stuff. For the scenario stuff, there's a literature of people who really have kind of this very almost technological approach to scenarios of, you get the people at the table, you get them to look at a map and, move pieces around on the map, and then that is input for a statistical model that then sees how much people agree, how many different perspectives are out there. And so that's an area that I haven't actually studied at all, and we didn't use it. But it's a different kind of approach to the scenarios. So yeah, there's a universe out there. I feel like that latter approach is where the money is. But yeah.
Well, thank you, Alexandra. Thank you.